Now we're going to move on to artifact detection, and I'm going to explain how to do this using the moving window peak-to-peak amplitude function for detecting artifacts. And this function works particularly well with blinks. So the way that this works is it takes an epoch of data, shown here, and it slides a moving window along it. So the green bars there reflect the window, and it finds the peak-to-peak amplitude in that window. That is the difference between the most positive and most negative point. And then it slides that window along, and for each window, it checks the maximum peak-to-peak amplitude. And of course, at some point, if there's a blink, that's going to be a very large value. And it does that for each one of those windows throughout the interval that you tell it to do it, and it then takes the biggest one of those and compares those against the threshold. That is, the biggest peak-to-peak amplitude within all of the windows that you test for a given epoch is compared against the threshold, and if it exceeds that threshold, the trial is rejected. Okay, so now let's see how this works in practice. So we go to ERPLAB and Artifact Detection and Epoch Data, and we select Moving Window Peak-to-Peak Threshold. This brings up the window shown here that has several different elements to it. First is the test period. This is the period within each epoch that we want to test. Ordinarily, you just select the entire epoch length, and that's selected by default. Then you select the threshold for rejecting. So this is the maximum peak-to-peak amplitude beyond which the trial will get rejected. This number here is the width of that moving window, and 200 milliseconds is a pretty reasonable value. There's also the window step. That's how much the window moves for each time you check the window. Having some overlap is usually a good thing, like a 100 millisecond overlap. Then you can also select which channels to do it in. You might want to do it just in your iBlink channel, or you could do it in all channels. Okay, so we're just going to accept those parameters. And it goes through. You can see that it's working channel by channel through the whole file. And then it brings up this window here that shows us our epoch data after artifact detection was applied. And the yellow region here indicates that this epoch is going to be rejected, or it's marked for rejection more technically. And then the red waveforms are the individual channels that exceeded the threshold for rejection. And you can go through and just make sure that everything worked right. Now at this point you can't unreject channels. You have to look at the documentation to see how to unreject epochs at a later time. But this is just so that you can see if things are working right. If things are working right, you close that window and you say OK in this window for saving the new data set. If you didn't like it, you could just hit cancel, reselect the artifact detection routine, change the parameters, and try again. Okay, but that looked okay, so we're just going to click OK, and it creates a new data set. And you can see we have our new data set in our datasets menu. Now we are ready for averaging. So averaging is very simple. You just go to ERPLAB Compute Average ERPs, and it by default is going to want to average from the most recently selected data set. So whatever the current data set is, it's going to select for averaging. By default, we're going to exclude epochs marked during artifact detection. So that just means don't include those ones that were rejected or detected and marked in the previous stage. You have many other options. For example, if you wanted to, you could include only the ones marked for rejection. And that's a useful thing if you want to know, well, what are the artifacts actually doing in an average? Because then you can see just what the trials are that have the artifacts. We're also going to include the standard deviation as well as the mean for our average. So click Run, and it's usually pretty fast, and it's done. Now we just need to select a name for it, and we're going to call it S1 underscore ERPs. You don't have to use that name, but it's good to have some kind of convention that you use so that you always know what your files are. And then let's also save this to the disk. So we're going to save ERP as, and we can give it a name here. And you should almost always use the same name for the ERP name and for the file name. So you can conveniently do that with the same as ERP name button. And you can see that it's going to get saved as S1 ERPs. And we click OK. And now we can see that we have an ERPSS menu active that has that ERP set in it.